we're going to explore the consumer as an investment vehicle. So usually when we understand the consumer is just about us buying stuff, we kind of disregard the totalizing claim that's made on life when life has to be given as a buyer's journey. And so if you are an interchangeable economic unit, a demand center, a credit instrument, then ultimately their whole commercial paradigm is orientated towards legitimizing the investment in that vehicle that we use for our lives. So if life is given as a buyer's journey, then you have to create the vehicle that you as a person sits in order to be orientated towards it. And so in that way, you won't question the nature ultimately of the reduction that you, or the redundancy, we should say, that you effectuate or that you create as a result of that. So if the consumer is the principal product, then we can look at the way how we invest in this vehicle and ultimately what we seek to redeem in doing so. So usually the way how this is framed is that we are orientated towards life to secure our financial independence. And so the act of redemption, in the case of cashing out, let's say, or creating enough wealth to have annuities that will cover our expenses after we have stopped working, is to fund what remains of our lives. And so ultimately what you set in train through the investment is a linear understanding of life through the investment in time. We discount the necessary question we need to pose to ourselves to look at life holistically and not as, say, markers or periods or anything, because if we are investing ourselves as the consumers that we're given as, that is a totalizing claim, irrespective of the way how that we would sell ourselves on what we do or the way how we would frame what we're working towards. So the easiest way to understand this is the nature of the divide that we work off. So if we are working on securing leisure, so if we look at retirement as the accumulation of what would be leisure, then we're looking at life marginally all the time. So we're never indivisibly given to life. We're looking at life as a compensation, because that's the return that you seek at the end of your life. And so therefore you're seeking the capital or the wealth to draw the annuities over time. And so, your redemption is found through the financialization of existence. Now, would we ever look at life this way? So if you are, let's say, you are looking at life as a spiritual journey, would you ever think to create a way of life that necessitates the consumer as a vehicle for your redemption? Now, ultimately, if you look at redemptive history, nobody will ever look at it like that, because once again, they always look at redemption, the way how it's framed in monotheistic thought, as being marginal. All right, because if you understand that God is separate to the creation, it's His creation, let's say, then your understanding of what is a redemptive history is predicated upon the lack of questioning that religion ultimately maintains. So how can you think outside the tradition when your very tradition is predicated upon the externalization of thinking? A religiosity, by default of it being as such, is actually the removal of thinking life holistically. How can a person, when they are beholden to it, the heritage that is handed down to them, ever question the legacy of that heritage without apostatizing? And so how can you read what you set and train when you cannot? You look at, say, that heritage as a value. All right, the value of your heritage. But if there's a totalizing claim that's made on time, so that life's a buyer's journey, that's just a value add to the buyer's journey that's been set for your heritage. So you will look at your your heritage through the identity that you invest in order to disregard the totalizing claim of the consumer, because you will not make the connection between it, because your identity in that context is subordinate to the form of life that is always transcendent. So people get sold on identity, all right, because there's value, there's a spiritual value, but once again, if you disconnect the identity from the form of life in order for you to find value in it, then it's just a value add. So once again, if your religiosity precludes you from questioning life holistically, how are you ever going to see beyond the identity that's always been sold? You're never going to be able to do it. And so therefore, when you're looking at redemptive history in inverted commas, you're going to see that marginally. All right, so you cannot look at the totality of existence in a way, because that it is precluded. You're going to apostatize. You are going to be ostracized. You're going to be an outlier. You're going to practice a form of heresy, as it were. Now, so that's a heresy in reference to, say, a form of faith that relates to a religiosity. What we are engaging with is a heresy in the sense that when you practice a bad faith because you don't question the truth claim of whether or not time is of value, obviously that is, you've immanentized a religiosity or a belief in something. And so if you apostatize, if you become a heretic by questioning out of bounds, then the nature of your apostasy is, as it were, is so all-encompassing that you can't fathom the nature of actually what you are setting in train when you do that. If commerce is ultimately not based upon goods and services, but essentially based upon a Faustian pact, that we don't know the nature of the trade that we make against ourselves, all right? So that's the way how the principal product that the economy produces is the consumer that you're given as, because that's sanctioned the way how things are given. But the principal trade is existential arbitrage, where you are obviously externalizing the creativity that you're not credited when you're given as a demand center. You won't make the connection between that principal trade is foundational and that principal trade is based upon a bad faith, because you never question the nature of the way how time's given to you, and that so the truth claim of whether or not it's of value or not. So if you can't do that, how are you going to see life holistically, and how are you going to see the redemption that what you're working towards in light of a form of religiosity that maintains it, all right, as like your subdivided Eden, your Sabbath at the end of life, as it were. How will you ever see that what you model your life on is based upon an impoverished understanding of spirituality? So we're looking at more a civilisational apostasy. So if we are, devout, but we are devout in a way that we don't actually know that we practice a form of faith, then when you question out of bounds, so the nature of the totality of what it means to be a human being, you are ultimately looking at the principal truth claim. You're ultimately looking at the principal truth claim that is obviously transcendent to any faith that people practice on the face of the planet now. So if you can't question the validity of that transcendental truth claim as whether or not time is a value, because you're always marginally given, then obviously the spirituality that you practice is a compensation. So ultimately you're a penitent, and yet you cannot make the connection that through immanentizing a spiritual disease, because you've spiritualized time, you are placed in a state, a suspended animation. You're in a no place. You cannot be spatially orientated to the market for your time. And so as a result of that, the investment that you make in the vehicle of the consumer that's your redemption. That's what you seek. You're seeking the compensation for being born. You won't never look at it this way, but in turn what you seek is the maintenance of a system to perpetuate itself, because you don't question where you are when you're given to life marginally. And so if the redemption is to be let's say, you put it in context of what would be outside the way how this thing is framed now. You're looking at a civilisational apostasy, because you have to question the nature of the way how time's given to you, because you're the product. You have to understand where you are when you cannot be spatially orientated towards the market for your time. You are beholden to an unavowed utopianism, or essentially you immanentize a underworld, as it were, a subterranean realm, as it were. Your marketed transcendence, which is social mobility. But as a result of through social mobility, you can only attain the credit that you're given when you're given as a demand center or a credit instrument. You're not credited creativity. So in that way, you will set up a way of life of redeeming creation, the world that we have created, and yet through that act of trying to attain a subdivided Eden, you are still marginalizing your birth, you're still marginalizing the earth, and you're not doing justice to being born. Because what you do is that you can't see that the question of justice got nothing to do with the social. So social justice, it's got to do with the question of your temporality or your time, and the way how you can do justice to your first birth, but not the way how that you get sold on being twice born through the use of a credit you are not the originator of. So you can see credit as a means of exchange rather than as credit to take ownership of credit, where you are credited as life. You do justice to people in that way, because they're never a means in your timeline. Because if, in the commercial paradigm, let's say, that we're orientated towards exchanges, what underwrites the exchange is the way how that we are always economizing our time independent of the relationality. You never see a person as a co-creator of a world, because you're obviously looking at life marginally, because you economize your time independent of the interaction that you have with people. And so as a result of that, you subordinate them to the preeminent good of your time. If it's preeminent, you consider your time valuable because it's always transcendent, because you're always orientated towards your little private Eden. All right. So because your vision, you're captivated with this vision, which is so small, so impoverishing, that's how it entrains you not to see where you are. You're in a fucking death realm. And so therefore you can see that the whole orientation of redemption, as it were, the way how redemption goes from this spiritual thing down, it just becomes financialized. And yet you won't make the connection between the two, because to a certain degree, you already stand accused. If you cannot be credited life, then you are qualifying your life through the way how that you legitimize the use of a credit you are not the originator of. If you can't see that, then there is a major disconnect. You dislocate the self from earth, because ultimately, if you spiritualize time, you cannot be grounded to place, because you're acquitting yourself of a transcendentalism which is not connected to the earth, but it's basically just a spirit. It's just the spiritualization of something which is existential, so grounded in your temporality, in life. All right. And so if you can't recognize that, then you won't obviously have the ability to look at life holistically, to look at what is occurring on the planet now in a way where you can see fully what actually you are dealing with, and ultimately the potential for your actions. Anyway, cheers.